Hello, my name is Alicia Shapiro with AInews.com, and today I'm here with Wendy with SAMA. Hello, Wendy. Thanks for joining us.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks, Alicia.
I'm so glad to talk to you today. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Absolutely.
AI foundation models are designed to be highly generalizable, but our real-world applications often require personalized solutions. What are some of your most promising approaches you've seen in tailoring AI models to specific user needs?
So the frontier models are becoming more and more advanced every day.
Yeah.
There is a new model coming out. Claude just delivered Claude 3.7 from Anthropic.
Right.
There's some incredible technologies. As these models get smarter and smarter, the real key is how can you adapt them for niche or personalized applications. And so we find, given that the technology is changing so rapidly, that the best way to do this is typically through prompt engineering or RAG embeddings. Okay. So that is where you can take data that is not on the internet, but basically proprietary data, and inform those models. And that works really well when you're creating a personalized approach. So think retail or e-commerce for a moment. Only that company will have information about those customers' preferences, what their buying patterns are, things of that nature, that wouldn't be available on the public internet, great for the general models to learn from. So it's a good way to tailor these models to create personalized experiences.
That's nice. What kind of personalized experiences do you work with typically?
So we work quite a bit in just general search relevance, and so that's very applicable for any e-commerce brand or any retailer. So we work with some of the largest retailers in the world that have millions of product SKUs, and what's really key is that you need to not only be able to search for them, but beyond being able to search for them and find them across highly complex taxonomies, it's almost creating a genome. There's so many different attributes of products, and you want to be able to search for those. But beyond that, you want to actually be able to have recommendations, right? You might like this. You might want the appropriate advertisement to show up. So we help customers, like Walmart as an example, create those kinds of experiences for their shoppers on their website.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's so important, because if you can show a product that your customer is going to be interested in, then they're going to be more likely to purchase it, and everybody's going to be happier, and they're going to be excited because they don't have to search 500 pages of products to know which one is supposed to be best for them.
Exactly. So it helps increase the value of the cart. It could also, in a more engaging experience, help reduce your cart abandonment, things of that nature. Yeah, it's very interesting. I was also talking to the startup that there's so many things that are happening now that you can almost translate things into aesthetics and taste. So that's, I think, where the world is going.
Yeah, that is very exciting.
Yeah, it is neat. Can you imagine saying, hey, this is my vibe? And all of a sudden, all of these products and opportunities and making the shopping and the e-commerce experience seamless. I think that's where things are going.
That's exciting. Your company, SAMA, emphasizes a human-in-the-loop approach to data annotation and AI model improvement. How does this method enhance personalization, and what role do you see human oversight playing in the future of AI customization?
That's a really good question. So there's so much automation out there, but the real key is how do you evaluate whether your model is performant, that it's doing what you expect it to do, that it's, in this case, giving you the right recommendations. So there are different methods. There are a number of automated methods, but it's like having the robot check the robot. So the automation has strengths in certain applications, but when you're embedding new data that, like personalized or proprietary data that the general model isn't aware of, because the general model's been trained on the internet and publicly available data, there are different techniques to model evaluation. And typically the right way to look at it is that you want to be cost conscious, right? Because especially for models that are in production, you don't just check them once, you have to evaluate them on an ongoing basis. What we believe is a really critical part is, yes, there are automated and semi-automated methods of doing it, but having human insight and validation, where you've got especially complex decisions or complex tasks, becomes very important. So if you're just simply trying to make decisions to, for example, qualify off a few key criteria, maybe you can do a lot of that automated. But if you're doing something in, say, a multi-step model or multiple tasks, you typically are going to want a human in the loop to do that validation. Human insight.
How does SAMA keep everything updated when the models are constantly improving and rapidly improving?
Yeah, that is the beauty of the human insight. Is the way that we look at it is the models are going to continue to change, right? Technology is going to change every single week. You probably, I'm sure, covered DeepSeek and then Kimi and all these things. It was, whoa, this technology is changing so rapidly. So we keep thinking about that as part of our process.
Okay.
At the end of the day, what we really focus on is model evaluation, which is how do you know what good looks like? How do you know your model's performing? Have you leveraged the right data sources to do? And then do you have a method in which you can evaluate that it's working well and working well on an ongoing basis? Doesn't include bias, doesn't have any unintended things that you weren't expecting. And so regardless of what the underlying technology is, how you determine something is of quality and accurate doesn't change.
That's true. That's a good point. And along those lines, what are some of the biggest technical and ethical challenges companies face when they're trying to personalize AI models? Are there any misconceptions about AI customization that you frequently encounter?
One of the things that I'm definitely a big advocate for and like to speak about, so they get the opportunity, is responsible AI development.
Right.
So responsible AI is really an approach towards how you develop the AI. Are you using the right data, right? Do you have the right to use that data? Are you protecting data privacy and security? So those are some of the ethical concerns. And I always say to like my kids and anybody who will be willing to listen, just make sure you just take a look at those terms and conditions. Don't put personal information into the models if you don't want that personal information to be leveraged. One is keeping in considerations of data privacy as well. And then evaluation. So the evaluation that I was talking about before is incredibly important because you need to know what those boundaries are and what are acceptable failure rates in your model. So a very simplified example of this, it's not really depersonalization, but a very simplified example is an autonomous vehicle.
Okay.
You have some very clear failure rates, right? You don't want it to run over somebody or things of that nature. But regardless of what your model is, even if it's not something like that, you need to identify what is acceptable. Is it okay if you search for something and you get the wrong product or the wrong categorization? Is that acceptable 1 out of 1,000 times? It really depends on what you're trying to achieve with that model. So those are the principles that I think are really important considerations, because at the end of the day, the reason why responsible AI is so important is that you actually want people to adopt the technology. You want that technology to be trustworthy. So from that perspective, those are the things that I think are really important. Regardless of compliance, you should be protecting people's data and privacy. You should be accessing data sources that you are legally able to access. And if you don't build those principles in place, then that's where you asked about the ethical considerations. That's where you can veer off path if you don't have those considerations when you're developing your models.
Yeah, that makes sense. You were talking about the failure rates. What if a company says, I don't want any failures? I know that's impossible, but like, how do you coach them to say, okay, you got to have something?
That is so true. Yeah, this conversation comes up a lot, sort of zero failure rate fallacy, which is not possible, especially when you're generating and consuming new data. The world changes, right? The data moves under your feet. And so this idea that it's 100% bulletproof is not there. So that's why you try to coach people and say, hey, think about what you think are acceptable failure rates. What's really interesting is that the reason why trustworthy AI is so important is because people expect more out of the AI than they do the human. So a good example of this is that Waymo, they recently published a report they drove something like 25 million miles. And for people to step into that robo-taxi, they did have better performance on average than most human drivers. An order of magnitude of 9 or 10x. But I think that's what is necessary for myself, maybe anybody, to go and step into that car. So you're going to assume it's better. So when you think about those failure rates, you actually are probably setting the bar a little bit higher, but that doesn't mean that it's going to be zero. Because to be able to validate whether or not you're having failures it's part of that evaluation process, and you have to think through the return on investment. And that's some of the biggest questions that I think people have is, we're building these personalized or niche applications off of these larger frontier models. How much money do I invest? How often do I retrain it? How often do I test and validate it? It can be quite expensive when you're using a large model.
Exactly. It's interesting that they have a higher expectation of AI than they do humans. I didn't even think of that, but
it is funny, right? Like when you think about trust and adoption, it's like you just expect it to be better. And so I think those are some of the considerations when you think about how to evaluate your model performance.
And probably the personalization they expect to be more on target than other stuff too. That's so interesting.
Which is funny, right? So think about like when you call customer service, and I will admit, I'm like agent 000 because I don't want to go through the prompts and all that kind of stuff. But I know that if I get a really talented rep, like, I might have a really great outcome. Like,
Yes.
I fly a lot, and so you're like, oh, they're going to give me my credit, they'll get me whatever, an upgrade, that kind of a thing. But then when you don't have that experience, you're kind of like forgiving. You're like, oh, that rep's probably less experienced. You might not have that same expectation when you're working with a chatbot.
Yeah.
The chatbot screws up, and you're annoyed. That's why you keep hitting 0.
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of a funny psychology in the expectations of AI versus humans.
That's so interesting. And Sama has worked with Fortune 50 companies on AI data solutions. Can you share a case study or an example where AI personalization has significantly improved business outcomes or user experiences?
Definitely. So we work with some pretty big companies, including some big search engines,
Yeah.
as an example. And yeah, the personalization experience is very important. More and more, whether it is from a shopping perspective, otherwise you want your information tailored to you.
Right.
Think about social media as an example. And we see that for some of our large companies that we work with that are both in social media and on search engine giants and things like that, because it's incredibly important to get relevant information to the user because, and I also have kids, they don't really watch television.
Yeah.
They watch YouTube and TikTok, right? And they're getting their stuff through on Instagram, and they're getting their stuff through their feeds. And yeah, it's incredibly relevant. And I can't think of any consumer-facing brand that isn't adopting a personalized approach.
Yeah, that's so important. I think that's great because, like we said earlier, the more personalized experiences, the better are the outcomes, and everybody's happier.
It's increased adoption. In the case of social media, it's more time
Yeah.
on that phone or scrolling through that feed. It's higher purchasing rates, higher dollars. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Research is rapidly evolving to bridge the gap between general AI and personalized applications. What are some emerging trends that are exciting you the most about in this space?
I'm pretty excited about the notion of open weight models versus closed models. I think that eventually maybe I don't know if we'll get to a point to where there's open source, but I am a fan of more transparency, so I think those are some pretty exciting things.
Yeah.
I think there are also these large models that are getting so and so intelligent. There are now different methods to distill into smaller to leverage those big models for specific applications, because the biggest thing we find with clients is that it's a return on investment, right? You use this big model, you run it, you train it, the larger the set of parameters, the more cloud computing you're using, the more it ships, and it becomes very expensive. So I think there's more and more happening towards different methods and technical methods to be able to get those models to support smaller applications, to leverage proprietary data to make them much more effective, and to make them more affordable. So
Right.
between that and the cost of chips ultimately coming down and some of these interesting new methods that have come about, right? Who knows how much it really costs to,
Yeah,
to build
train.
DeepSeek? Like, who really knows how much? But I think it opened up this idea that you can distill and have all these other methods in which you can bring the cost down.
Yeah.
And that's what's really exciting, because that's when you're going to get many more applications, much more adoption.
Yeah.
I was talking to an investor yesterday who was like, yeah, we got 4 or 5 years before maybe some of this gets all the way to our phones. So we're
Right.
still a long way towards being able to run models on our laptops and phones. But we will get there.
Yeah.
Eventually.
Yeah, just a few short years.
Yeah, I think it's going to happen faster than we think. So yeah, those are some of the things I'm pretty excited about.
That is cool. Yeah, it's very exciting to think what's going to happen. I don't know.
It's crazy. It
Yeah.
is so disruptive right now.
Yeah, and it's changing so much. It's hard to predict what's going to happen, really, because it changes in a couple of months' time. And yeah.
Exactly. So we're enjoying the ride. Our goal is ultimately to help enterprises figure out how to adopt it in a way that is a great experience for their customers.
Yeah. Do you think the businesses who have not adopted AI yet are behind, or do you think it's fine that they're waiting a little bit until some of these technologies and everything catches up to what they want to do?
That's a really good question. I would have said a year or so ago, there were a lot of questions that were still happening, or maybe in the last 2 years, where companies were like, do we build it ourselves or do we leverage these
Right.
frontier models? And we saw a number of enterprises who started to invest very heavily. Then we're like, oh, wait a second, maybe that's not our bread and butter, and like our real bread and butter is what we do in our core product. So I started to see some of that shift where maybe it was slightly early and the technology was shifting so much that people were really trying to figure out, do I build it on this frontier model or do I build it myself? Now, I would say if there isn't some consideration of how to adopt this, then yeah, you might be a little bit behind. There are so
Okay.
many both operational efficiencies, and now there are more and more technologies that I think are really going to allow companies to unlock some of their own proprietary data. So think of I'm going way out here a little bit, but think about some of these really old systems. Like think about like utilities and energy and things like that, where the systems and the data sets are really old or archaic. There's now so much technology out there that is enabling that information to be translated so that Gen AI models, for example, could support it. So there's some pretty interesting things happening right now. But to maybe roll back a little bit, the key thing is that adoption of AI is ultimately it's a partnership between humans and machines.
Yes.
So it's where on that spectrum will adoption happen, and I still firmly believe it's still a human. That's the thing. It's a human and machine partnership. That's the real, let's say barrier to adoption, but that's the real consideration of how fast can we move.
Wow, that's great. That's amazing. And for companies looking to implement more personalized AI solutions, what key advice would you give? How should they approach data, model training, and ethical considerations to ensure their success in their implementation?
So I think the very first thing is be really clear about what your model, like what is your AI application? What are you trying to build and how can it be differentiated? If you have to have that really well articulated, because that is what is going to drive, can it be differentiated? If you build it's probably not the best example, but if you build a navigation app, you can try to build that navigation on your own, or you can just leverage Google Maps. So unless your navigation engine does something really unique or specific, how is it any different than the next person who's using Google Maps? And so the key question is, what is the differentiation that you want to build within your application? Then, yes, of course, you can pick a model that might be better suited to start with, but focus on where your product can be differentiated versus commoditized. That will help drive your data strategy. And then the ethical considerations I would keep in mind, or what I shared earlier for responsible AI, which really, are you, for your application, are you using the right data sets, the model, and any proprietary data that you want the model to learn? Are you getting the data in the right way? Are you protecting privacy? Are you documenting what the purpose of your model is so that you can properly evaluate it and ensure it doesn't go off the rails and have unintended biases?
That's such great advice, especially about making sure you're putting the differentiation first instead of just the commodity, because if you know how you stand out from your competitors, I would think you'd have a clearer strategy and purpose in implementing the AI.
100%, because otherwise anybody can take Claude 3.7 or Llama 4.0 or whatever it is. It's really about what are you building, and then do you have, from our perspective and a data strategy perspective, because all AI is built off of data, then you know what data do you need to inform your model so that it can perform that application better.
I love that. Great advice. Thanks, Wendy, for joining us today. I appreciate your time and your insights. It's such a fascinating conversation. I appreciate your time.
Thanks, Alicia. Appreciate it.
And how can people find more information about SAMA?
You can find us at sama.com.
Awesome. Thank you for joining us again and keeping you connected to tomorrow. Today, this is Alicia with AInews.com.